Yeah, for those of you joining online, maybe you would prefer to be on campus, but you can't today because of distance or circumstance, or as is the case for many right now, sickness. We are glad you're able to join from online, and pray that you'll be able to rejoin us soon. A lot of people are dealing with sickness right now. Hey, thanks, guys. More to come on these stools later, just to pique your curiosity a little bit. But back in the early aughts and late 2000s, I used to subscribe to a magazine. I don't any longer. It was a magazine called Runner's World. And at the time, I would have described myself as an occasional runner, meaning that I ran maybe 3 times a week, basically just enough to have a baseline that I would be able to run the annual race to Roby Creek that happened every spring. And here's what happened. Runner's World kept repeatedly, every so often, they would run this article inviting runners to do what they called a running streak. So running streak running is not what you think it is, to start with. What it was a 40 days of running consecutively. Every day, you had to run every single day, and you had to run at least a mile to keep the streak alive. And when I first read the first article about that, my first response was like, what? Are you guys crazy? Which is kind of how some of you are looking at me right now. Can we have that next slide? Oh. Happy Groundhog Day. I'm messing with you. If you're wondering what's happening right now, last week I started with the exact same illustration. So, Groundhog Day falling on a Sunday doesn't happen very often, so I had to leverage that. All right. Can we get a real title slide for this morning? Yeah. Channeling my inner Bill Murray. All right. Today we're actually in what is week 4 of a 5-week series called Practicing the Way, specifically related to the practice of Sabbath. And this week we're on the topic of delight. So what we're looking at over this series is we're rediscovering the long forgotten and often ignored ancient practice of Sabbath, which was established by God all the way back at creation and was practiced by Jesus during his earthly life, during his incarnation. And what we've seen is that recovering God's intention for his people to practice Sabbath was one aspect of an invitation that Jesus made to all those who were considering becoming his followers or who had become his followers. We've been using the language of apprentices. And Jesus had this invitation for them, and practicing Sabbath is a part of his invitation. So here's that invitation once more. It's Matthew 11, verses 28 through 30. Are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Notice he's talking about rest and work together. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. Now, when we start talking about Sabbath, we don't all start on the same page, because some of us have like zero context or no framework whatsoever for Sabbath. Some of us have very negative experiences or negative connotations as it relates to Sabbath. And some of us are actively practicing Sabbath and just wanting more of it. Or already practicing but saying, I know there's more. And so that we're all on the same page, here's how we've defined it. First of all, the word Shabbat, Sabbath or Shabbat, it actually means to stop, to cease, or to be done. It's basically to hit the pause button in our weekly rhythm and to create kind of an intermission. in the midst of everything else. Right? So these four movements, this stop, rest, delight, and worship, we've been tracing through the origins of Sabbath over the last 3 weeks now. This is our fourth week. We're tracing the origins of Sabbath, and what we've seen is that there's basically four different connotations or interpretations of that word that are brought out. We have, thankful to our friends at Practicing the Way who've pointed out this particular rhythm. But what we're doing now is we're spending 1 week on each of those rhythms. The stop, rest, delight, and worship. And though they're not necessarily sequential, I think we do have to start with stop for this reason, because stopping is what creates some space in our lives. And it kind of creates this container, and then we get to decide, what do we put in the container? If we're just going at breakneck speed, if we're just frantically doing life without pausing to think about what we're doing, we don't really have a choice with what we fill that with. But when we stop, we do. So it does create the question, we looked at this briefly the last 2 weeks, is when do we stop? When should we, as 21st century Christians living in America, when should we practice Sabbath? And it's not a one-size-fits-all. We've given three basic options. One is we'll put this in quotes, the Christian Sabbath on Sunday. Christian because the early church in the first century, they moved their holy day, their Sabbath, they began worshiping on Sunday instead of the previous rhythm of Friday evening to Saturday evening, because they recognized that was the day that Jesus was resurrected, was on Sunday, and they said, we want to move our day of worship to this day, right? So there's the Christian Sabbath on Sunday, best for most of us since it's also our day of worship, which is one of the four kind of rhythms. There's the traditional Sabbath from sundown on Friday night to the same time on Saturday. Or there's a midweek Sabbath for those with non-traditional work schedules. I would suggest that if you're introducing this, that you find whichever one you can most consistently do, because there is something to this 6-in-1 rhythm, to having 6 days where we're actively working in this day that's set apart, that's consecrated, that's holy to God. And so, additionally, if taking that as a full day is too much for you to bite off at once, we were suggesting just pick 3 to 4 hours. Pick the day, but then block out 3 to 4 hours that you can begin practicing Sabbath. And what we were saying is start where you are, not where you should be. Okay? Sabbath is one of those things that we could come at one another with lots of rules and regulations and say, you should be doing this. And don't do that to yourself. We're not doing that to you. Don't do that to yourself, and don't do it to your household. Because if this is a practice that you're introducing, it would probably be unkind to suddenly force this on your entire household. But here's what I believe. This has been true about me, and I think you're like me, is that when we began to practice this in just a small way, we began to experience how good it is. And then it made us want more, right? So just start where you can and trust that as God meets you there, you'll want more. So this brings us to the next movement of Sabbath, which is rest. We looked at rest last week. The idea of rest overlaps with stop. You can tell there's some similar connotations there. But it recognizes that the experience of rest, so it's not just being like immobile, but actually rest, right? Taking a deep breath. What restores and refreshes me? That looks different from person to person. For example, this week, Pastor Mike, actually in yesterday's devotions, Pastor Mike writes devotions, daily devotions for us on topic of where we are as a church. Yesterday's devotions, Pastor Mike described during his sabbatical that he had this Sabbath rhythm, and it was he and Luane dancing. And if you know Mike's regular rhythm, the things that Mike's usually engaged in, it's understandable how stepping outside of all of those responsibilities and activities and dancing with his wife is refreshing. If you invite me to dancing, I might rather be waterboarded. If I have to choose between the two, right? So with that in mind, here's what we've done. We've introduced a filter to help us identify what creates and what nurtures rest for our souls. And not only for ourselves, but for those in our households or our families or our immediate community that we're seeking to practice Sabbath with. So here's what we've said. This is Ruth Haley Barton. I actually printed this quote out and put it in our kitchens so I can be reminded of it regularly. To practice Sabbath, we need to know what we are in bondage to. What controls us, right? What has us in its grip. And that is precisely the thing that we should cease. We need to know what wears us out and what wears us down. Pay attention to this line, what robs us of our joy and peace. And cease that. Because that is exactly what God wants to set us free from. I think that's a deeply helpful filter because it allows us to observe. One of the things we looked at last week is God commanded the second generation of Israel to observe the Sabbath, which is to kind of watch over it, to be thoughtful about it, to practice it, but do so thoughtfully. And I think for us to enter into this rest, it requires us paying attention to our lives, not just living on autopilot, but stopping to pay attention. Is this thing that I do, is it actually life-giving? What does it create in me, right? Being thoughtful and attentive to our souls, to our minds, and to our bodies. Paying attention to what creates bondage, what creates freedom. To what wears us out and what feeds our weariness, or what replenishes and refreshes us. That's what we're looking for. What replenishes and refreshes me, my soul, my body, my mind. I want to suggest that using that filter over time, you can take a picture of that if you want, write it down. That filter is really helpful. Using that over time will allow you to pay attention and then to adapt and learn about yourself and your own household rhythms about what it looks like for me or us to actually find what is restful. So that brings us to this week's rhythm, which is the word delight. And delight is the part of Jesus' invitation to, remember he said real rest? I'll show you how to take a real rest. Delight is the part that I think redefines what was the historic approach to Sabbath. Because Sabbath wouldn't have always been described by the people who were practicing it and the people who were being told to practice it. It wasn't always experienced as delight. Think about the clashes that Jesus had with the religious contemporaries in his day. And it had often, many of the conflicts Jesus had with the religious community was the way that they practiced Sabbath and the way that he practiced it. And they felt like he was constantly breaking it because he was just bebopping and scatting around and healing people and hanging out with his friends and walking through cornfields with his friends and walking next to lakes and setting captives free. And they're like, that looks like work. Mark 1 contains one sample of a Sabbath in Jesus' life. This is very early on in his ministry. It's one of the very beginning of his ministry. And on that Sabbath, here's what Jesus did. This is a little snapshot of a Sabbath in the life of Jesus. On that Sabbath, Jesus went into a synagogue to worship. Okay, so kind of like we're doing. He gathered with people for corporate worship. Then he read and he taught from Scripture. Most likely, it doesn't say this in Mark, but if you look in the other places like Luke 6, the things that he was teaching often were like Isaiah 61, which was talking about him coming to announce good news, to bring delight and God's joy and God's goodness and mercy, especially to the poor, those held captives, those needing healing. So he may have read Isaiah 61. Then while they're gathered, a man starts manifesting a demonic spirit, and Jesus sets that man free from that demonic oppression. After synagogue, he and his friends, they went to Peter's house. They reconvened at Peter's house, Peter and Andrew. And arriving there, they find out that Peter's mother-in-law is sick, so sick that she can't get out of bed. And so he heals her. And then they spend the rest of the afternoon just sharing a Sabbath meal, resting. And that evening, all the people in town, took place in Capernaum, all the people in town come to the door of Peter's house, and they bring their sick, their demonically oppressed, those with diseases, and Jesus heals them all of whatever was afflicting them, right? That's one Sabbath in the life of Jesus. Essentially, Jesus enjoyed the day. He delighted in that day's opportunities, even the ones that weren't expected, right? The person manifesting, all the people showing up at the door. He lived in such a way that he extended his joy and God's mercy and God's goodness to all those around him. That's one Sabbath. But it very much reflects God's intention for Sabbath, stretching back to creation. Remember, we looked at this. This is the very first Sabbath, and it goes back to God's good creation before the fall. Genesis 1:31. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. This is God pausing from the work to enjoy it and go, hey, I like that. This is the sixth day. This is after all of creation has been completed. There was evening, there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing, and on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Now, pay attention to this. This is important. On this day, then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it, he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. This is when God weaves this rhythm, this seventh day rhythm, into all of creation. And he actually blesses all of creation. That's the furthest, what's the furthest reach of God's influence? What's his sphere of influence, his scope? It's all of creation. And so into it, he puts this thing called Sabbath, the seventh day rhythm, and he blesses it and sets it apart as a special day on which to delight, to savor, to be appreciative. And God does this. I mean, you see him sitting back and looking at his creation and going, oh, that's very good. Which is, John Mark Comer compares this to that moment when you finish a big project in your yard or at your house, and you've been working on it and you're grimy and grubby, and you go in and you shower and you clean up, and then you grab a cold beverage and you go and you sit on the porch to just take in what you've done. And you go, oh. And you know that it's gonna need it again next week, right? I experienced this during the fall. I get all the leaves cleaned up, and I go in and I shower, and I come back, and I just want to savor it, and there's already a single leaf. And I'm like, ugh. But no, you're supposed to stop and delight. But not only that, God blessed all of creation. I want to suggest that Sabbath, as God intended, it's more than just a personal rest day. This is not just self-care. In our culture, there's an appeal to Sabbath actually in our modern culture, because it touches on something that self-care is after, but it's much deeper than that. And here's why it's different, because God didn't just take care of himself, he blessed all of creation. And when we as God's image bearers, we say, I know that I need a seventh day rest, and I'm going to use that to bring blessing to other people, it begins to transform the culture. It's like engineering the environment in our households, in our communities. And so it's not just like two people living in the same house, each doing their self-care on the same day. It's the two of them saying, we know that we need this, and we're going to create this for one another. And so I'm asking, how do I give blessing to the other people in my household or in my immediate community? How do I extend that? And when we do that, we actually begin to change the whole environment. We change the economy to shared delight and Sabbath. So we're going to unpack all of that in a moment. Before we do that, I just want to read a few more. This morning, you're going to have some real life examples. We're going to jump into the nitty gritty. But I want to read the scripture that Pastor Mike had us in all week in our daily devotions. It was this, Isaiah 58. Now pay attention to this. This is great. This is the very end of the chapter, Isaiah 58. If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath, this is God speaking through Isaiah to the people, and from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own way and not doing as you please and speaking idle words, then you will find your joy in the Lord. And I will cause you to ride in triumph on the heights of the land and to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. This Isaiah scripture tells us that Jesus' practice of the Sabbath, even though it confounded and bothered the religious spirit in the people that were contemporary to him that day, he wasn't coming up with some newfangled twist on the Sabbath. He was getting back to what had always been intended, This is Isaiah. This is some 600, 700 years before Jesus. And Isaiah was calling people back to this kind of Sabbath. So this idea of delight, we're not making that up. This is God's Sabbath, right? Jesus was recapturing what was always God's intent. A day set apart for delighting in God, for obeying his instruction as an act of trust. Interestingly, the context for those two verses is the whole chapter of Isaiah 58. The bulk of the chapter, everything before that, verses 1 through 12, are not about Sabbath. They're actually about the spiritual practice of fasting. And the people are being rebuked and corrected because they'd been fasting in a way that they thought was, religious observance, being obedient. And they thought that by doing that, they could trigger God's blessing. That by pushing the right buttons of fasting, that God would bless them, and they were missing the point. Listen to this. They're doing all of that, but they're mingling. In the words of one commentator, they're mingling meticulous religious observance with social ruthlessness. I just want to repeat that. They're mingling meticulous religious observance with social ruthlessness, meaning they were indifferent to the needs of others, especially the poor and the socially disadvantaged among them. Their hearts and mouths were filled with anger and violence. Listen to what he says. We're going to read just a few verses from there. Isaiah 58, verse 3. Why have we fasted, they say? This is God speaking through Isaiah. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves and you've not noticed? Then God says, yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife, in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is not this the kind of fasting that I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke? To set the oppressed free, to break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and to not turn away your own flesh and blood. If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and the malicious talk, if you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry, satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness and your night will become like the noonday. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs, even in a sun-scorched land. He will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. It's in the context of all of that correction about how they were meticulously observing God's laws while excluding other people, while being indifferent to others, that God says, no. This practice, at the heart of it, is about something very different. He calls them back to his intent for fasting. He calls them back to his intent for Sabbath. And amazingly, I think surprisingly, maybe, when he talks about Sabbath, it includes this invitation to delight and to joy. So with that in mind, we're going to unpack this aspect of delight. Here's a quick definition for you. Stopping and resting on the Sabbath, that's our first two rhythms. So you might think about how we're stopping from our vocational work or our daily responsibilities, everyday responsibilities. That creates space, and then we fill that space with delight and joy by savoring God's goodness. This is every manifestation of God's goodness. And then thanking him. It's hearts of gratitude. Again, that's going to differ from person to person, from family to family, from circumstance to circumstance. Meaning Sabbath, it's not a one-size-fits-all. I heard a guy say this week that his Sabbath delight is reading poetry. And again, I'm like, poetry waterboarding. If you like poetry, that's your Sabbath. So here's an additional filter to run things through as we experiment with how to observe Sabbath in our season. It's this: what could I do for Sabbath that would bring us deep, visceral joy in God? And you might consider delighting in God's world. That's creation itself. This is material world and all of delight, goodness, pleasures, joy. Also delighting in God's word. It's part of what we're doing today. Delighting in God himself. We're going to talk more about this stuff when we get to worship next week. So here's what I recognize. If I can invite our guests to come up. This is James and Amberly Rich. I've been dialoguing with various people in the church who are participating in this series. And one of the things that I've heard is questions. People wanting to be able to practice this, like longing for what this could look like, but hitting up against some obstacles and saying, well, in our family rhythm, how would that work because of these things? And so the reality is, Andrea and I are in a different season of life where we were empty nesters as of a couple years ago, apart from our dogs who are very cooperative. So it's easier for us to introduce Sabbath because we're dealing with two people's schedules and not a whole household. And so James and Amberly have actually been practicing Sabbath for maybe 6 or 7 years now. And anytime I've talked about it, they just light up. They're like, oh yeah, Sabbath, right? And so I wanted to just come ask them some questions. Some of the questions I'm going to ask them today are ones that I've been hearing from others. We had a whole life group processing these questions together, not only to talk about the obstacles, but to brainstorm solutions to those things so that they could try it. And so I've asked James and Amberly if they could come and just share with us a little bit. So can you guys welcome them? So how about start with this? Maybe you can tell us about your family. How old are your kids and how many?
Yeah, so I am James. This is Amberly. We've been married for 15, almost 16 years now. Time flies. And we have 2 incredible kids. They're in kids ministry right now. We have a daughter who is 10 and a son who is 8. And yes, I did practice all of those numbers beforehand, so I didn't get them wrong. Amberly and I work together. She is my boss on some days, and I'm her boss on other days. We kind of flip-flop. And so we work from home, and we also homeschool. And so for me, a lot of times, getting out of the house is a little bit of a Sabbath. And so you'll hear some of that down later. But yeah, that's us, the Rich family.
Okay. So when did you start practicing Sabbath and why?
Well, at first it was just a conviction. We both grew up in a Christian family, went to Christian schools, and I had never thought of keeping the Sabbath as like actually setting a day and doing something different. It was always in my mind, like just going to church was keeping the Sabbath day holy. I'm like, this is the easiest out of all of the 10 commandments. I can totally keep this. I just go to church every Sunday and I'm good. And we had this realization when, I'm a huge reader and I love to just learn about like how to have a better marriage and be a better parent and just in all different aspects of our lives. And we joined this Christian homeroom group. It's a mentorship program to really help us disciple our children and be a family team. And they had monthly challenges, and one of the monthly challenges was to practice the Sabbath and have a Sabbath feast meal. And I was just so convicted that we've never done this, and I've never even heard of anyone doing this before. And so that just gave us the first taste of it, and then from that point I was like, ooh, this is interesting. And so I started researching and reading and listening to sermons and podcasts, and it's grown from there.
Yeah, and early in our marriage we figured out that being okay with experimenting was great, because a lot of times we try to implement something in our life and we're like, okay, we're going to do this, and it becomes like this thing that we have to do. Right. But we found that approaching things as an experiment, the thing about an experiment is you can do it, and then if it doesn't work, you stop doing it, right. Or you tweak it, or you change it. Right. And so that's kind of the mindset that we had coming into our marriage, and even raising our kids is like, okay, let's just try it out, see how it goes.
Just try it on. I like it. So that was 2018, 2019 when you started. You're still doing this today. Why are you still doing it? What has kept you exploring and tweaking and implementing?
Well, because after a while, at first really hard, especially those of you workaholics. Anybody? Like, you just like Saturday, for us, we do it on Saturday. We'll get into that a little bit later, but I was like, I get so much work done on Saturday, like,
Right.
and then I don't have to work as hard during the week. And so once we got past that, and this was something that Amberly really pushed to implement, I was not excited about it. And like, let's see a raise of hands. Like, how many of you guys are not excited about the idea of Sabbath? It's okay, yes. But coming from a recovering workaholic, it gives us so much life. Like, we finish up our Sabbath right before dinner Saturday night. And so I come into church, and I've noticed if I have a Sabbath or if I don't, I notice a difference of how well I interact and listen and worship, even in these services. Like, a lot of these practices that we try and implement get just like poured out into my mind, and I'll be sitting over there, and my mind will be just going 1,000 miles a minute, just like, oh, here's all these things that it just gets me so excited. I think we've kept it going because we've seen the benefits that have come out, and we didn't see them at the beginning. Like, it was really hard, and some of that was because we were experimenting. We were trying to find what was working, what wasn't.
Yeah, and I think it's just been so life-giving. It's been the core of how we live life. Like, it makes us live the rest of our days differently, knowing that we're going to have a true rest, not just for our body, but for our soul every week. It just helps me to realize that, like, I can do other things, and it just reorders the rest of the week. And I just feel like it's been helping us to not burn out. It helps us to say no to the right things, and that way we're able to say yes to the things that really are good for our family and for our faith.
The other thing is, the day before Sabbath, I've really been noticing that I get so much more focused because I'm like, okay, I know I can't touch any of these tasks that I have up here. And so I've got to get these done as quickly as possible. And so there is somewhat of a preparation for Sabbath. And that's not just in our work. It's also around our house, preparing for Sabbath meal and all of those kind of things. So it does, Amberly mentioned that it changes the way that we live our life. And it's not just at the beginning of the week right after Sabbath, but it's also at the end of the week right before Sabbath. Yeah. We have changed the way that we interact with life.
Yeah, and I had an aha moment this week just thinking about this topic. And when I look at this as a practice, it's not like you just do this once and you're good. It's like exercise. Like, you have to be working on doing this on a continual basis. And when I look at giving, when I give, and this has always been a struggle for me, it helps me to trust God with my finances. And that's something I have to do on a continuous basis, because if I just do it once, it's not like, ooh, I'm good and I totally trust God forever and ever. Like, it's something I have to do and keep working out. And I think that's part of, like, we have to work out our faith. And the same thing with fasting. Fasting on a more continuous basis. I've been doing that this past year, and it has been really life-giving. But it helps me to trust God with my physical health and my body. And connecting, not just knowing God, but actually experiencing Him with the temple that He has given me. And then when I look at Sabbath, it helps me to trust God with my work and with time. And that is something that is really a struggle for me, is to know where my time is going and to trust Him with work and with everything that He gives me. And so all of those practices, the more you add all those practices in, the easier it does become. But it also helps me to let go of the control of wanting to just figure it out on my own, and releasing that control to God.
Yeah. I think it's really easy for us to look at whatever spiritual discipline we're looking at and lean towards the thing that's the easiest for us. Like, for me, it was modeled, being wise with your finances and be a good steward. That was modeled to me as a kid. So that came naturally easy. So to me, I'm like, well, that's one of the most important spiritual disciplines. Right. And then when I really started leaning into the practice of Sabbath, I started realizing rest was not modeled to me. And even more so, if a spiritual discipline is difficult for you, that's the one that you probably need to lean into. And that's when I kind of had that switch in my mind of like, okay, I'm going to lean into this because I know it is hard, but it's so rewarding.
So you're telling me to lean into dancing and poetry. I get it.
Very much, yes.
I heard it. As I'm dialoguing with people, hearing back from people, one of the questions that comes up is people are mentioning different obstacles that they hit, even in trying to anticipate how could we do this, or here's what we keep bumping up against. What obstacles, you guys have got like a 7-year track record now, what obstacles have you hit and how did you get over them?
I think getting started, like, how do you actually do this? And it took a while for us to take that process of, like, how do I actually put this into practice without it being weird? Like, we didn't invite people into our Sabbath until probably a couple years in, because we were like, we don't want to weird people out. Right. But for some of it was figuring out, like, when should we do this? We tried a lot of different times of day. We tried different days of the week, but also different starting times. And it took a while. And the nice thing about Sabbath is it happens once a week. And so
right.
you got 52 tries a year. And so if it doesn't work one week, you're like, okay, that's an experiment. Let's tweak it and try something different.
Yeah, I think the not being weird was one of my biggest obstacles. My first experience with a true... I know, I am weird.
All of life.
All of life, yes. But my first experience with Sabbath has always been more of the traditional, the Jewish Sabbath and all the rituals that happen. And to me, that always kind of just like turned me off, because I didn't want to have to read a language I didn't understand and didn't know. And I didn't want to do all these things that didn't have meaning to me. I wanted it to be something that we could invite a non-Christian in, right. And they would be like, that was really cool, which we've done. We've done in the past. We've had non-Christians join us for our Sabbath meal, and we'll talk about kind of what we do. But one of the things is we have somebody in the hot seat, and we put them in the hot seat. And the hot seat does not mean we catch your chair on fire. Right. You're the person for that week that we're just going to pour life into and speak goodness over you and see the things that we love about you and build them up. And so, I think the biggest thing, one of my biggest obstacles was I saw how Sabbath was done in the past. And I didn't like it. But then I also reading the books like Little House on the Prairie and Farmer Boy, and you read how they did Sabbath, and I'm like, that sounds awful. Absolutely terrible. Like, you just sit on a hard bench and like take a nap if you want, and we just read the Bible, and like that's pretty much it. There's no smiling. You can't smile on Sabbath.
Yeah.
And so that was the obstacle for me. But I think if we look at the Israelites, the obstacle for them coming out, even they had obstacles. They spent, 430 years in slavery, and then they were released. Their whole identity was around how many bricks can you make, right. 7 days a week for 430 years. They get out. 3 months later, God's like, you need some parameters around this. Right. And he gives the 10 Commandments. And that's where he outlines. And if you look at it, it's like 32% of the 10 Commandments word-wise is associated around Sabbath, right? And because they needed that understanding of what it looked like, and so, I think there's that mindset shift. And even when we read the Old Testament, we look at Sabbath a lot of times as very restrictive, right? And you have to remember again, like the Israelites just came out of 430 years of this constant work, and is like, okay, this is what it looks like to not work. You have to understand it. You don't do this, you don't do that. I think now we no longer need to live out of a restrictive perspective when it comes to Sabbath, but more of a permissive, like giving ourselves permission to do the things that bring us rest, joy, delight, what worships God through that process.
Yeah. Emily, what obstacles do you recall hitting?
Food was an issue. Trying to figure out, like, we wanted to have a big family feast. And so at first I thought, well, maybe it'd be a good idea for us to have like the same meal every Sabbath. And then I tried that, and I was like, that lasted like half a week. For those of you that don't know, Amberly was an art teacher, and so that might give you perspective as to sticking to one thing for forever. That felt like a restriction to her. It boxed me in, and I was like, I do not like that. And so, yeah, our Sabbath meal is different each week. And, you know, I know for some people that's amazing. Like, they just get like pizza or something that's easy. Like, that's great. But that part was a challenge of figuring out, like, just the mechanics of how do I prepare to actually rest, and what do I do while I'm resting so that way it actually is restful. Like, especially, when we started quite a while ago, like I was a young mom, and like I think when you're in that stage with young kids, you don't think about yourself and like what is filling you up. It's like you're focusing on helping everyone else. And so it was really a turning point for me to think about what does give me rest, and then having to explore that and try something and realizing that was not restful. Let me try something different next week.
Yeah. That was one of the questions that came up in our dialogue was how, because that's a real practical reality. How do we, because a lot of the Sabbath practice involves feasting, but that's work to make a feast. So how do you do that? And so we'll get into the mechanics of that a little bit, but even as I shared last week, like in our household, that's not my responsibility in a daily rhythm, and it's not my paid job. It's not my vocation. I enjoy cooking, so that's something I can do on the Sabbath, that I can do as a way to bless my family and create delight for others, and give Andrea a break from cooking. And so that's where we're trying to create an economy where together we're not just taking self-care, we're saying how do we create Sabbath and bless one another and invite one another into it. Any other obstacles you guys want to hit before you describe a typical Sabbath?
I would just say phones, like the draw to social media and to just be on, I know it's just addicting to have a phone.
Right.
And so that was one thing that we really recognized early on, and it's still been a struggle. I mean, there's points that I actually lock my phone in our safe for the 24 hours because I know it's just like too tempting. I need more barriers. I have to put the code in to actually go and get it.
Right.
But we got a device about a year ago, I don't know.
Yeah, so Amberly's a lot more disciplined around the phone issue. Like she can put it in the safe, and I just like, I want to reach out to somebody. And I found this tension between, okay, don't use any device at all. And one thing that fills me up is connecting with people, like catching up with my roommates from college or calling my dad or whatever it is. And so, but when I would pull out my phone, then it would draw me into this kind of cycle of just all going into it. So we have searched and we found this little device that, much like the little stickers on the back of the chair, we go to it, we can set different modes. We have a Sabbath mode. We can go and we tap that, and then it locks down all the apps that you can't use. You go touch it, and what does it say when you say,
this is a distraction?
This is a distraction. It pops up, and you can't get to it. And so the Sabbath mode, I have texting available, phone calls, and maps. Sometimes we go out for an adventure or something,
right.
and it's so much easier. I pick it up, and it's just like a dumb phone, and like staring at a dumb phone doesn't do a lot for your dopamine, and so you put it down a lot easier.
Awesome. I think I need Sabbath mode all the time. Okay, but maybe can you just describe, so you guys have been experimenting for several years now, what does a typical Sabbath look like for you today with what you said, a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old?
8-year-old.
8-year-old, okay.
Yeah.
What does it look like?
Yeah, well, I think first there's prep beforehand. Like we have to get things ready to embrace Sabbath. One thing we've noticed is if our house is messy before the Sabbath, it's not very enjoyable.
I can ignore it. She can't.
I can't. And so we make sure that the house is clean. We've changed the rhythm. Before, our kids were cleaning the bathrooms on Tuesdays, and now they're doing it on Friday morning and afternoon. And so that way, like, all of that stuff is done. We make sure that we don't do our laundry during Sabbath. So, like, all of us need to make sure all of these things are prepared beforehand.
Yeah,
so
and
that's helped.
We don't do a, like, sunrise, sundown, that kind of thing. We do dinner. Like dinner introduces us on Friday night to Sabbath, and then it goes until once we go to eat dinner on Saturday. That's kind of when Sabbath ends for us. And so it's not whether it's not light or dark outside, like the traditional way.
So it's Friday night, dinner time. What does that look like? What happens?
So we added a new rhythm into ours, and this was from a couple of weeks ago. We talked about, I think it was Genesis 1:31. You talked about it today, and about how God, he created for six days, and then he looked at everything and he said, it is so good. And I had this idea sitting over here right after a Sabbath. I had an idea, and we implemented it. And the idea was, we have this task list inside of our our shoffice. We have a backyard shed that we work out of, our company shed quarters. And we have started putting a list of all the things that we have to do for that week, and we cross them off as we go. So that list is still there. We see everything that was crossed off. And now to start the Sabbath, our rhythm is Amberly and I walk in there, we look at this list and we see all that we have done, and we say, it is so good. And then we erase those things that we finished. We go in the house, we sit down, Amberly lights the candle, and we start our meal. And that's kind of what starts, that's a new part of our practice, starting with the candle. We've been doing that for years.
Yeah, so what we do is we've had the kids really be part of the process. So we have them set the table, and we have a tablecloth, and we have 3 different tablecloths. So the kids get to choose the tablecloth. They set the table. So it was good for us to like train them on how to set the table and get things prepared. We have a candle, and when I light it, typically the mom does it, and that signifies that you're done with working for the next 24 hours. And the kids have done this, like when I'm like doing way too much throughout the week, they've done this on occasion. They'll bring the Sabbath candle to me, and they're like, Mom, you need to light this candle. And they know that, like, okay, I'm like, oh, I need to slow down and
feedback.
Yeah. So that's Friday evening, but the thing that we have our own filter. Our own filter when it comes to Sabbath is, does it glorify God? And does it bring us life? Mm-hmm. And so you'll see this a lot, especially in our next day. So on Saturday...
Well, I think we still should talk about the feast.
Okay, sorry, go on.
So with the feast...
Rob, could you put that slide up for that filter?
So with our feast, what we do is a lot of times we'll eat on china. We'll have cloth napkins. A lot of times, like, we'll just have the nicest meal, and we have a lot of food. Like, I want to make as much as possible, so that way, even if someone just randomly showed up, there would be plenty of food. And it also makes sure that we'll have leftovers for the following day, so that it's like, it really does help, and it helps me think when I'm going grocery shopping, like, I want to make sure we save the best food for the Sabbath. And we have just a wonderful time with our family, and we do bring people in somewhat frequently. But one of the things that we do is we ask, what were the highlights of this week? And so we get to reflect on the highlights of this week. Then we also have someone who's on the hot seat, and we just do it from oldest to youngest. But when we have someone come and join us for the Sabbath, we put them on the hot seat. And then at the end, James blesses each of the kids. So he has them sit on his lap, and he prays a blessing over each of them. He prays a blessing over me, and then I pray a blessing over him. And then when we have people over, we often pray a blessing over those people as well. And so it really is a sweet time, and it is different than the rest of the meals that we have as a family.
Yeah, and so here's a couple of pictures. Here's one, and then the next one, just kind of showing variety. A lot of you guys know these two. They're sitting back there. Hi, guys.
Sabbathing with the non-Christians. I see that.
And then the next one, this is a picture of another set that are in here. Are they here today?
They're in Salt Lake.
Oh, they're in Salt Lake. Okay. And then finally, last one, the cool thing about Sabbath is it doesn't always have to be at your house. So those of you that know, we took a 2 month, it felt like 2 years, 2 month sabbatical, and we lived on a ranch in the middle of the Ozarks. And so we brought Sabbath with us. And so you can bring this rhythm everywhere you go.
It's portable.
It's portable.
Yeah. And it just helped us to figure out, like, well, how can we make this work? So, like, our kids picked flowers from the garden. This was a table that they had 2 tables on this ranch, and so this was like a big one that we never ate at except for the Sabbath.
Yeah, and then Saturday morning we sleep in as long as possible. We keep that clear. In our calendar is clear on Saturday. We'll do Bible reading and journaling. I'm dyslexic, and so me just sitting down and reading the Bible is not restful at all. But pulling up the Bible Project and watching that with the kids and us, like, just taking that in, that is, it kind of goes for my filter. Does it glorify God, and does it bring us life? And it does. And this week, it was a little bit different. We were sitting there, Jonathan was playing with Legos, my son was playing with Legos. I was over on the couch just sitting there kind of relaxing. Amberly was in bed reading a book, and Selah was doing something else. And then Jonathan just pipes up. He's like, Dad, I want to hear more jokes, but I don't want to hear the ones that you already have said. I was like, okay. I was like, what kind of jokes? And he's like, well, poop jokes. And so we pulled up the laptop. I looked it up, and we had bathroom humor. I'm not going to repeat any of them. They're kind of hard to get out. And, but like that, we just find things that we can delight in, and we went down a rabbit hole for like an hour and a half of just reading these absolutely ridiculous jokes. But there's other weeks that it looks a little bit different. Like when the sun's out, we'll get the bikes out, we'll go on a ride down the green belt. We'll stop for donuts at Guru Donuts, and we'll bring board games, puzzles, and we'll just, whatever it is that is gonna bring us life, that's what we're gonna do.
Yeah, that's awesome. One last question. How do your kids feel about Sabbath?
They love it. I mean, we asked them both, and what is your overall, like, what do you love the most about Sabbath? And they both said rest, and that all of us are resting together, that we all are able to have time together.
Yeah, our daughter said, I love that we don't work. I was like, oh, you don't like doing the chores and things? She's like, well, yeah, but I love that you don't work. And I said, well, why do you love that I don't work? She said, because we get to spend more time with you. Yeah. And so it's been this rich, beautiful thing for our family that's bringing life and also glory to God and all at the same time.
That's awesome. Thank you. We're going to close with, I'm going to give you a couple of just resources as potential things to follow up. If we could put that book up first, get that book. This is John Mark Comer. He wrote a book called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. This is a book that I read that it changed my framework of thinking, oh, this is actually something that I would want to do. And one of the things he describes in there, we have a few copies of that available in the bookstore. Also, Rihanna restocked because last week the shelf that had sabbatical resources on it got completely wiped out. So she restocked that, but there's several copies of this. If she sells out, you can find it anywhere you can find books. John Mark Comer, he tells a story. I'm pretty sure it's in there. I couldn't find my copy to recap, but basically I remember him telling the story where on Sabbath, his family, and this is probably when his kids were young, especially, I think he's got 3 kids, they would make a single chocolate chip cookie in a cast iron pan. Like that's a big chocolate chip cookie. And when it came out of the oven, they'd let it cool off for just a few minutes, and then they would take a big scoop of vanilla ice cream and put it in the middle, and then sit that cast iron pan in the middle of the table, and then give everybody a spoon. And everybody in the family sits around eating this cookie while they talk about God's goodness in their lives. And so and the thing that he said that I've heard him say in a couple different places, he says, we do what we call pleasure stacking. And pleasure stacking is where you save something that you really enjoy so that you can have several things that you really enjoy on one particular day. Some people do this for vacation or for a honeymoon. They approach the Sabbath that way. And he says, so we don't eat dessert every day of the week because we want to really look forward to it when we have it on the Sabbath. And so Marva Dawn is somebody that's quoted in Sabbath or Sabbath type curriculums quite often. She said this, she said, we don't know how to feast because we don't know how to fast. Meaning that if we're constantly, satisfying every desire, then it's never special. But by saving some things and stacking them all on the Sabbath, it gives you a chance to really savor and enjoy those things, and to do so in a way that's with gratitude for God. To say, God, thank you. Thank you for the ability to enjoy this thing. Thank you that we have this opportunity. So, so much more could be said on this. Because of that, I'm going to give you one more resource. This is an audio podcast. It's a QR code to an audio podcast. This is a 1-hour episode specifically on this topic of delight. And this is John Mark Comer along with a couple of panel discussion people that he's doing it with. And it's a great listen. You could listen to it a couple times and get different things out of it. But if you want to go deeper and you don't feel satisfied with how much we've covered this morning, encourage you to listen to that. It'll be life-giving for you. And with that said, we're going to close in prayer. So if you're on campus, could you stand with me? Our prayer team this morning, they gather before service starts and spend some time just praying, trying to discern, God, what do you want, anything specific you want to say today? A couple things that they sensed today. One was related to the goodness of God and to joy and to perfect peace. which I think all of those are encapsulated in what we're trying to create in this practice. And so, the reality is Sabbath comes every 7 days, and it comes whether the circumstances of your life are bleak or whether they are, easy to celebrate. And in it, so oftentimes it's a choice. It's a choice to say, I'm going to look for God's goodness in the midst of circumstances that are quite difficult, right? And so I don't want to ignore that. But if you need eyes to see that, if you need eyes to see God's goodness, to awaken joy, even to consider engaging in this, maybe if this is a new thing for you or you want to go deeper, but you want to do so from a place of anticipation and joy, not for religious, obedience, just, for itself, but as a way of delighting in God's goodness. I just want to invite you to receive prayer this morning. And what we're going to do, I'm just going to close in prayer. But if you would like our prayer team to pray with you and maybe just pray for an impartation of joy and delight and goodness of God and peace. If that's you, maybe you're in circumstances right now where the circumstances are not conducive to peace. Would you just let our prayer team partner with you and pray with you over that? And we'll just come up front so people can talk out here and head out and head into your day, but we'd love to pray with you. So Lord Jesus, thank you for your model of Sabbath as we see you living as one not enslaved to Sabbath, but Lord of the Sabbath, and showing us what it looks like to recover your Heavenly Father's good intention, this rhythm that is woven into the fabric of creation. God, would you awaken in us creativity as we bump up against obstacles and consider how might we implement this? Would you show us new solutions to old patterns? Holy Spirit, would you brood over us and breathe creativity into us and joy? And I especially pray for those whose lives right now are not conducive to delight and to joy. God, would you impart something deeper than circumstances? I pray for eyes to see who you are and what you're doing, to anticipate your goodness, to anticipate your joy. And Lord, would you send us as a blessing, even as you blessed all of creation, would you send us to bless those around us today, whoever we encounter, that we would impart your delight, your goodness, your joy, everywhere we go. So fill us up to overflow. Amen.